This is Kozlowski for AP Gov Review, and in Unit 3, Part 1, we'll be looking at interest groups. And interest groups are very important to the policy-making system. I've shown you this chart before, and really the ultimate end, if you will, of what people want to do in government is to affect policy, whether that be the rate of taxes, whether that be regulation on the environment. But it all comes down to people's interests, their problems, their concerns. And one of the ways that people are going to relay this to get onto the policy agenda for Congress, let's say, is via linkage institutions. And if you recall, the linkage institutions of Unit 3 can consist of anything from the media, political parties, elections, and of course, interest groups, which is going to be the main topic of today's conversation. And if you notice that any of these interest groups right here are playing a very important role in terms of the policy agenda, whether it be the American Civil Liberties Union, the NEA affecting education policy, or probably one of the most renowned interest groups being the National Rifle Association, otherwise known as the NRA. So what are the roles of interest groups? So just by definition, they're an organization that just seeks to influence public policy. That can again be anything from should there be more restrictions or fewer restrictions on gun ownership? Should there be higher or lower taxes? Ultimately, interest groups are going to be pursuing their goals in many arenas. It could be at the state level, it could be at the national level. But do know that it is very, very distinct from a political party. Whereas a political party is involved in trying to get a particular candidate into office and represents many, many different wide-ranging views, from taxes maybe to one's foreign policy. Interest groups are policy specialists, meaning that they focus just in one particular interest. Good example, again, being the NRA, being on gun ownership. In contrast, of course, political parties are policy generalists. They don't just focus on gun ownership like the NRA, but they will focus on foreign affairs. They're going to be focusing on the military. They're going to be focusing on just a whole host of issues. Again, interest groups, very narrow specialist interests, whereas political parties, much broader. Now, just a quick history. Not that you'll probably see this on the AP Gov exam, but you could potentially have some form of it, or this brief history could help you in some way. But really, when you look at the first interest groups, they start with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Yes, you could say that they are considered political parties, but really in their infancy, you could call them interest groups because their main goals at this point were very much tied to the ratification process during the Constitutional Convention. Federalists, of course, wanting ratification, wanting a stronger government, whereas Anti-Federalists, their interests were preserving state sovereignty, that the state should be making the decisions and we should not have a strong central government. And then by the 1830s and 40s, certainly that was with the anti-slavery movements. And then by the turn of the early 19th century, you also have trade unions, you have charity organizations. And if you look as far back as, or not too far back, but 1960s being with the rise of environmentalism, consumer protections, political reform organizations, those are all, again, specific policy specialists, right? You are looking at those narrow interests being represented by these groups. So they have existed since the birth of the United States. Now, when we look at the different types of interest groups, a lot of them tend to come down to economic interests, specifically labor. Good example of that. You have some that are right-to-work laws or right-to-work interest groups, which want to outlaw union membership, whereas union shop, of course, espoused by most unions for the most part, require new employees to join unions representing them. So even there, just with labor, you have that happening. Agriculture, certainly business has them, again, representing their own field. Almost every type of business is going to join on it. I mean, for example, you have a restaurant association, you have a realtor association, all designed to protect their economic interests. You also have environmental interests, good example of that being the Sierra Club, Equality Social Interest, National Organization of Women, otherwise known as NOW. And then you also have consumer and public interest groups such as the Children's Defense Fund. So they do represent a wide variety of interests when it comes to these groups, but a lot of them tend to be over economic matters, although it's not just limited to that, of course. So interest groups do play a major role with democracy. If you recall back to James Madison's solution to the problems posed by interest groups was to create many of them so that you would certainly have some that would counterbalance each other, and saw that as a plausible solution to the factions that were inevitable to arise. And if you recall back in Unit 1, we were talking about pluralism, the idea that there's sort of this healthy competition and that ultimately public interest would prevail. Of course, you have the elites who, the elite theorists who see that as really the proliferation of business PACs, political action committees, as evidence of interest group corruption. So they sort of have a negative view on interest groups. And then you also have the hyper-pluralists who say they're really just, that group influence of interest groups has led to policy gridlock, where you might have contradictory policies at the federal and state levels. So you have a number of views on that. But ultimately, interest groups seek to maintain policies and programs that benefit them. That makes sense. They are self-interested. After all, they are called interest groups. They will certainly continue to pressure the government to do more things and advance their cause as far as possible. Because, again, at the end of the day, that's what they do. So as the government does more, does this cause the formation of more groups? Yeah, it really can. And certainly the number of interest groups has risen quite steadily. But when we look at sort of the roles that interest groups play, well, they supply credible information most of the time. That can be to their own supporters, that could be to the general public, that could even be to congressmen and women. They will raise public support. That could be through TV ads. It could be, again, just soliciting mailers to the public. They will also create political action committees. They will make campaign contributions to the candidate that the interest group deems favorable towards their particular cause. A good strategy that interest groups do employ is that they will hire former government officials, sometimes as lobbyists. It's known as the revolving door. Along with that, seizing opportunities to protest and disrupt. Again, that might be contingent upon what the interest group is representing, can be helpful, especially through the use of the media. Another way that interest groups are going to gain notoriety and try to affect the policy agenda will be leading litigation. So, for example, if you have a pro-abortion interest group, they might try to challenge a particular law that might restrict abortion and they might disagree with. So through the courts is a great method that interest groups can have an impact. Sort of along the same lines, interest groups, while maybe not being a part of a Supreme Court case, but they have an interest in, again, going back to the pro-abortion group, let's say, might, on a Supreme Court case that deals with that matter, will file what's called an amicus curiae brief, meaning a friend of the court, and they will provide a reason why the Supreme Court should rule a certain way. They will frame the issue for the Supreme Court justices and give their opinion on the matter. So that's another way that interest groups can certainly affect the outcome of the Supreme Court, which of course has profound implications for the policy agenda and for laws and regulations that affect the country every single day.